In 2021, I visited the abandoned city of Pripyat in the Chornobyl power plant. Walking around the nuclear debris and the streets completely reclaimed by nature set me thinking about the future. Not about the future as a direction in time, but about the future as a cultural construct. How do we represent it? What do we see in it? Most importantly, where do we get the hope that the future will be bright? Back in the Soviet Union, nuclear energy generation was hugely mythologized in mainstream culture. The idea of the peaceful atom implicitly contrasted with the military atom and the use of nuclear bombs inspired a huge amount of visual art filled with the hope that the better days are ahead, that we will get the amount of energy we need to make that optimistic future possible. With the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, that hope was shattered. The idea of a utopian future with limitless energy proved to be its dystopian and apocalyptic opposite. What I think this realization marks is a huge shift in our relationship with the idea of utopia. For Thomas More, the 16th century creator of the term utopia, it referred to some prosperous country located on a faraway island in a new world, which made sense in the age of discovery, since European colonizers sought a new and better life on those distant lands. The same was the case with the mythical city of El Dorado, presumably located somewhere in South America. Later on, however, after the whole planet had been explored and, surprise surprise, no paradise was found, the idea of utopia shifted from a location in space to a moment in time. The Age of Enlightenment brought us the grand narrative of progress and the belief that the future will be better. This utopian belief in the future was especially apparent in Marxist thought. Novels like News from Nowhere by William Morris depicted a future world of mutual kindness in which private property has been completely abolished. The culmination of that belief in the future came in the 20th century with the movement of futurism, marked by an infinite faith in technology and speed. But then 2 world wars, numerous genocides and catastrophes put all this into question. Is there actual progress? Is utopia really in the future? Is it even a thing? For Franco Berardi, the turning point for this shift in understanding was 1977, the year when the punk movement exploded with the famous proclamation "No Future" by the Sex Pistols. The future was no longer seen as a placeholder for hope, it was more like a place of damnation, of an apocalypse, a hopelessness similar to that depicted by Bela Tarr in his movies. The idea of utopia as something that the world is moving towards became obsolete, but have we lost hope in utopia as such in its entirety? At first glance, it's true that the utopian worldview has been largely replaced by the dystopian one. The popularity of books like 1984, as well as the post-apocalyptic books and films, is just one example of it. But utopia itself didn't disappear. Instead, it changed its direction in time. Instead of expecting a kind of utopia in the future, we now seem to be wondering whether utopia was there in the past. What I notice, for instance, in American culture is a lot of nostalgia for the 1950s, as if those were the most prosperous times for the country and thus the most utopian. The philosopher Zygmunt Bauman called this phenomenon retrotopia and said that the future is now seen as a very risky territory, more like a minefield, with the past being way more familiar and dear. He said, "We are not the ones who control the present from which the future will germinate and sprout, and for that reason we entertain little, if any, hope of controlling that future. In the course of its formation, we seem to be doomed to remain pawns on someone else's chessboard, and in someone else's yet someone unknown and unknowable game. What a relief, therefore, to return from that mysterious, recondite, unfriendly, alienated and alienating world, densely sprinkled with traps and ambushes, to the familiar, cozy and homely, sometimes wobbly but consolingly unobstructed and passable world of memory. Memory of our, not their past, a memory to be possessed that is used and abused by us and us alone." The past is nowadays seen not as something set in stone, but as something that can be easily changed and manipulated, as very malleable material that we can reorganize to embody our own hopes and dreams. The aesthetics of retrofuturism is a perfect illustration of that, since we cannot conceive of a future that would be radically different in a good way from what we have today. We turn to the past for its representation of the future. Retrofuturism makes us wonder whether, at some point in history, we made a radical mistake by not following one of the possibilities the past offered. This kind of nostalgia is what Mark Fisher writes about in his book Ghosts of My Life. He's writing about the slow cancellation of the future, about how we gradually become unable to imagine a new kind of future, specifically in the case of music culture. He offers a small thought experiment to explain that. Imagine any record released in the past couple of years being beamed back in time to, say, 1995 and played on the radio. It's hard to think that it will produce any jolt in the listeners. On the contrary, what would be likely to shock struck our 1995 audience would be the very recognizability of the sounds. Would music really have changed so little in the next 17 years? Contrast this with the rapid turnover of styles between the 1960s and the 90s. Play a jungle record from the 1993 to someone in 1989 and it would have sounded like something so new that it would have challenged them to rethink what music was or could be. While 20th century experimental culture was seized by recombinatorial delirium, which made it feel as if newness was infinitely available, the 21st century is oppressed by a crushing sense of finitude and exhaustion. In another passage, he reflects on the concept of futurism as such. Consider the fate of the concept of futuristic music. The futuristic in music has long since ceased to refer to any future that we expect to be different. It has become an established style, much like a particular typographical font. Another example of this is the representation of space in the movies. It seems like the most ambitious and innovative depictions of space came from the times of the space race, and everything that came after would just copy a lot of stuff from the older movies, such as Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey. So when you're watching a space movie nowadays, it somehow feels retro, because the space aesthetics were something developed in the middle of the 20th century. For describing this phenomenon, Fisher uses a term coined by Jacques Derrida, hauntology, a combination of the words haunting and ontology, that is, the study of what can be thought to exist. What they mean is that there are phenomena that cannot be defined as something that just exists in the present. Instead, those phenomena are defined by their relation to something that used to be but is no longer. For example, the music of the 21st century is haunted by the music of the 20th, and thus can only be understood and defined in relation to the music of the past. What's important to note is that for Fisher, hauntology isn't the same as nostalgia. It's not just a longing for a past from the point of an inferior present. What we long for isn't the past, but the promise that the past gave us regarding the future. Fisher says, not only has the future not arrived, it no longer seems possible, meaning that the past's promise for the future was never realized and never will be. What remains to us then is trying to reconstruct those unrealized possibilities of the past, hoping to find some consolation for the present. In other words, a retrotopia. We can further split the idea of hauntology into two aspects, form and content. At the level of form, what makes a work of art truly hauntological is the effect of its belonging to a time long gone. With music, Fisher writes, is the sound of vinyl crackle, the apparent feeling that what you're listening to is a recording of something from the past. The thing is, with the modern digital technologies, it's become very easy to immerse yourself in the music, to start feeling as if you're listening to the very thing as it's being played live. But it's not just about music. Film grain, especially in films like The Sound of Falling, is used specifically to create a feeling of distance between you and what is being filmed. Or, if you look at the photos from around Pripyat in 1986, you'll notice grain caused by high levels of radiation, creating a weird feeling that the boundary separating you from the objects in the photo isn't just the boundary between the present and the past, but the boundary between life and death. Fisher generalizes this idea and talks about the metaphysics of crackle as such. If the metaphysics of presence rests on the privileging of speech and the here and now, then the metaphysics of crackle is about dyschronia and disembodiment. Crackle unsettles the very distinction between surface and depth, between the background and foreground. In sonic hauntology, we hear that time is out of joint. At the level of content, the idea of hauntology and retrotopia is often embodied in the image of ruins. Ruins are a very liminal space because they are located somewhere on the edge between nature and culture, with nature slowly getting the upper hand, returning to that primordial idyllic space that we may safely call retrotopia, even though that nature of the ruinous future may easily turn out to be dystopian, as depicted in the video games like Stalker, with their dangerous anomalies and mutants, or in the haunting art of painters like Pavlo Makov with their enormous plants taking over the planet. Ruins are also a paradoxical kind of space. They remind us of a past that fell into decay and yet impress us with their durability, with the way they outlive entire civilization. On the one hand, they tell us of the grandeur of the past, but on the other, they mock our futility by reminding us that the future is not going to be bright, however much we hope for it. They embody a sensibility first described by Denis Diderot in the 18th century. We are the sole survivors of an entire nation that is no more, Such is the first tenet of the Poetics of Ruins. And yet ruins are also a reminder of our own inevitable death. Shelley, in his famous poem Ozymandias, tells us about a traveler from an antique land who stumbles upon the ruins of a monument to Ozymandias, who was certain in the eternal might of Egypt under his rule. The inscription on the remains of the monument said, "My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." The ruins of the king stand both as a reminder of a past glory and of its inevitable fall. The present is haunted by both the images of past success and the looming destiny of the future. Retrotopia becomes a consolation, but also a trap that will eventually get you. This is also the point that Derrida and Fisher make, that haunting isn't just about how the past haunts the present, it's also about the opposite, about how the future haunts the present. A prime example Derrida uses is the first line of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx says that a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Even though communism itself at the time was only a set of ideas devoid of practical realization, it was already playing a part in undermining the present state of things. Another example is how works of art seem to be imbued with an anticipation of a disaster that follows them. This is the realization I had at an exhibition dedicated to the Chernobyl disaster in Kiev, where I noticed that pre-meltdown art from the 70s and 80s seems evocative of the events that follow them, as if haunted by the disaster they didn't yet know about. In this sense, Fisher says, hauntology refers to that which in actuality has not yet happened, but which is already effective in the virtual. The novelist Winfried Georg Zebelt finds another way to describe this paradox. In his novel Austerlitz, he talks about how outsized buildings cast the shadow of their own destruction before them and are designed from the first with an eye to their later existence as ruins. The idea of destruction seems inextricable from the idea of construction, just as the imagination of urban expansion seems to contain within itself the vision of abandonment. So it's no wonder that Gustave Doré, having illustrated the life of the 19th century London with all its vividness, ends his series of engravings with an image of a New Zealander who contemplates the majestic ruins of the city. Doré, as well as Fisher and Derrida, tells us about the paradox of culture. The bigger, the more sophisticated it gets, the more it realizes its own inevitable downfall. Maybe that's why the images of ruins and decay attract us so much. They seem to remind us both of our grandeur and of our own eventual deaths.